Thank you. Thank you, Corinne. As Corinne mentioned, she had asked me to give this talk, which is funny because I was in the Resiliency Committee kind of planning the community read, but this turned out pretty well. So I am the wildlife biologist at Parker River National Wildlife Refuge on Plum Island, where I've been doing a lot of climate resiliency work. And as part of the Climate Resiliency Committee in West Newbury, we're kind of using some of the same techniques. So that's really what my talk is going to be, kind of connecting the two. I'll be mostly focusing on the work that we are doing on the refuge and in the Great Marsh, but taking those lessons and applying it to communities that might be thinking about how they want to address the climate vulnerabilities that's facing their town. As Corinne mentioned, this is part of a larger effort in West Newbury to shed some light on climate impacts. The grant that the town received was to focus on River Road, which those of you that don't know it is between Coffin Street and Bridge Street along the Merrimack River. And the main concerns that we have seen lately has been flooding. It actually flooded 4 times this past winter, as well as the road is facing some erosion. So you can see this tape measure and how close the road is from the river itself. So we wanted to kind of get ahead of some of these issues that's kind of facing us and learn more about it so that we can take more long-term lasting solutions. So for my professional job, I work out on Plum Island, which is a barrier island. And as a barrier island, it's obviously facing a lot of climate change forces right now. And I'll be talking a little bit more about that, but it has some pretty diverse habitats that's characteristics of a barrier island. So beaches, dunes, shrubs, salt marsh, and then some cranberry bogs that's kind of in the middle of the dunes, which, you know, are always interesting. If you kind of zoom out a little bit, Plum Island and West Newbury, where I live, is connected through the Merrimack River. And interestingly, it was during the last ice age, the melting of the last ice age, when the Merrimack River made a left turn from Lowell and decided to come out through Newburyport. It deposited a lot of sediment out into the ocean, which was reworked, that created Plum Island and Salisbury and the refuge that I currently work at. So it is also connected geologically through and ecologically. If we zoom out a little bit more, we are part of the Gulf of Maine's ecosystem. So we're here where the Merrimack River dumps out. And the Gulf of Maine ecosystem is a shallow ocean system that is bound by Cape Cod and Georges Bank and Nova Scotia. And the incredibly rich aquatic resources and the coastlines here have been used by indigenous people for thousands of years or tens of thousands of years, and then the colonists when they settled here a few hundred years ago. But if you look at the current projections, it is also an area where the ocean water temperatures are warming faster than almost any other ocean in the world. And that warmer waters is actually accelerating in the last 20 years or so. So on average these days, the temperature in the Gulf of Maine is hotter than it should be or than the average is. And those of you that pay attention to climate and weather probably know that warm ocean temperatures has a huge impact on the storminess of an area. And we've experienced those as well. So greater precipitations, storm surges, coastal storms that just kind of hit infrastructure. We've seen fires in some areas of the country and in Canada. A few years ago, we've had some insect outbreaks. Phenology, which is the timing of biological systems, has been changing. And of course, increasing temperatures is also an impact from a human health standpoint. So before I go a little bit more into the project that the Refuge and our partners have been working on, I just want to take a minute and talk a little bit about terminology. So when we're talking about climate impacts, I like to talk about three different terms. The first one is exposure. And exposure is really how bad or how the magnitude of the climate impact. So how bad is the disease outbreak? How high is the tide that's coming? How much rain is coming? And if we're in a coastal area, there's kind of two components to exposure. One is the normal sea level rise or the normal tides, and that is increasing, as we know, over time. And then the second one is if there's any storms offshore, how much is that added flooding or added surge on top of that? So that's typically what the models are predicting when they do coastal flooding modeling, is they're modeling these two interactions. Vulnerability is the things that we care about. How sensitive are they to those exposures? So here I have two examples. This is on the left is a house on obviously there is quite a bit of impact, some damage. On the right is a storm that is hitting Sandy Point and has breached the dunes and the water has come in. So in terms of damage, there's a lot of damage in the house, I imagine. There's some change here, but whether or not how damaging is it, I think that's somewhat subjective. It depends on how you're looking at it. If you are a foraging habitat and nesting habitat, it looks like there's some infrastructure. Resiliency is the do they have insurance? Do they have resources to rebuild and replace? And then whatever kind of enhancement they need to do to protect from future impacts. For this natural dune system, nature kind of takes over and will shift and adapt. So typically nothing is needed if there is no human infrastructure that needs to be protected in these situations. So I'll just step back and mention that the refuge, which is green here, is in the middle of the Great Marsh. And the Great Marsh is mostly salt marsh and the associated kind of barrier beach and dune systems from Gloucester all the way up to New Hampshire. In total, the salt marsh itself is about 23,000 acres, and it is the largest salt marsh system that's north of New Jersey. So for many of us that work in conservation, the marsh has always been kind of in the background. It's been constant, not really changing much. And then in 2009, 2010, a bunch of us saw some drastic changes as we were walking around the marsh. We were seeing these areas that were getting wetter. We were seeing bare spots, grasses dying, kind of different types of erosion, calving, where entire banks were sloping into the creeks, and then a lot of algal blooms and water that was kind of ponding in the marsh. And then that algae would on a high tide onto the marsh, and it would actually smother the grass. So the cycle kind of continues. And so a lot of us were obviously extremely alarmed and we got together and kind of tried to put our knowledge together to understand what was happening. Luckily for us, we are co-located in Plum Island with a long-term ecological research station that is funded by the National Science Foundation, and they have been studying the salt marsh ecosystem and how it interacts with climate and human land use for about 20 years or so. So we know a lot about how our salt marsh system works. And salt marshes are living systems. They're not static, even though they look static from the road. And one of the researchers that works there likes to say that a marsh is never is constantly changing. The marsh is either growing in height, in elevation, or it's growing or shrinking laterally. So you're losing either marsh on the edge or the marsh is moving upwards. And very rarely is a marsh actually staying still. Another component that we know a little bit more about is that there's two types of grasses. There's a lot of different grasses, but there's two main types of grasses in the salt marsh. There is a short Spartina patens, or the salt marsh haygrass, that makes up the majority of the salt marsh that's in the Great Marsh and in Plum Island specifically. And then along the creeks and in small areas, there is this taller Spartina, the Spartina alterniflora, the tall, big cordgrass that lives in areas that are more flooded. So these guys like to be flooded once a day or twice a day, whereas the Spartina patens lives higher up on the marsh platform and is flooded about once a month. And so for about 3,000 or 4,000 years, we have this salt marsh haygrass, very classic New England salt marsh. And with climate change, what is going to happen is it's going to shift the conditions so that it's more suitable for this Spartina alterniflora. The good news is the Spartina alterniflora is a very robust plant. And as it gets more flooded, it's actually going to grow faster. So it will be able to keep up with sea level rise much better than the Spartina patens. And we have models that kind of tell us exactly when that shift might happen. So this is a model that came out a few years ago. And looking at this, we are keeping the marsh we have, and it's going to shift in about 2070. So a little bit ways, we shouldn't be seeing the changes that we have been seeing. So the question is, what is happening? The science is telling us that our system shouldn't be changing, but we're seeing it. This is where it's good to have diversity in our group, and some people in our group are a bit of a historians. And we know that our local towns and communities have a long history with salt marsh haying, and we see the old historic photos, the paintings. And we also know that during the Depression era, the government had a program to put people back to work, and a lot of them were hired to dig ditches. So a lot of the ditches were dug during the WPA era, as well as mosquito control did a lot of digging of ditches to try to drain the marsh to abate mosquitoes. So we know some of the history of what's happened in the marsh. But it wasn't until one of our colleagues who likes to read really old farming journals late at night found this article in American Farmer from 1820 that described, it actually gave a drawing. It's a set of instructions on how to ditch out your salt marsh. And it turned out that this practice was done so much that they had companies that you can hire to ditch out your salt marsh. And President John Adams actually wrote about it in his journal in the marsh in Connecticut that he owned. And then another colleague in New Jersey came across a similar conclusion and found this painting that's from Nova Scotia that kind of depicted what it would have been like, what this graphic looks like. So here is a group of men that are building a big berm to keep out the tides. And then they have ditches, and you can kind of see the ditches in the background that allows water in. So because salt hay was so important to the colonists, they did a lot of work to try to increase production. And they basically managed the tides and did a lot of alterations in the salt marsh to increase production. And eventually they kind of abandoned the salt marsh haying, and a lot of the infrastructure that they put in place eroded or kind of faded away. But even today, they are still in our system. So here is a berm that is slightly higher than the adjacent marsh. And you can kind of see that this area, the grass isn't very healthy because this berm is still holding water and not allowing it to drain. And then if we look around a little bit more, now that our eye is trained, we kind of see these features everywhere. So this is a berm next to a ditch through the marsh. This is an aerial photo. You can see all the ditches that were dug. And then as these ditches clog because they're no longer being maintained, these marshes are getting wetter. Eventually, the clogging ditches and some of these leftover berms create these impoundments in the marsh where the grass dies and these megapools form and these areas keep expanding. And there's a couple of areas in Essex and Salisbury where all you have left is strips of salt marsh adjacent to the ditches, and the rest of the marsh is actually open water. And then this is an area that had multiple mosquito control practices. And you can kind of see there's just a lot of wetness and a lot of ditching and berms in the area. So Jeff Wilson, who's one of the guys I mentioned that kind of discovered some of this history, has trained himself to recognize these features, both through aerial photos and through field surveys, and have been teaching some of us on how to recognize them. This is a map he did of one of the units on the Refuge. And the red areas, the red lines represent the different berms that were built over the 100, 150 year period, the different generations of ditching and berming. And the green represents all the ditches. So you can see that the farmers actually has some significant impact on the marsh. And even though the marsh has started to heal some of this themselves, a lot of them are still out there. And when you add climate change, sea level rise, and storms, the marsh just doesn't have enough time to be able to heal naturally from the historical practices that were done. So what do? So we kind of now have a paradox, right? So we have a marsh, and we know that marshes are living systems, and then healthy marsh will keep up with sea level rise. The thing about salt marshes is that they need flooding. We need the salt water and the sediment in order for the marsh to keep up with sea level rise. But if you put too much water in the marsh, then the plants die and the marsh will drown. The marsh also needs to drain. So at every low tide, once a day, and then on the monthly tides, the roots of the marsh grass tend to drain so that they can maintain their energy balance and be robust and put that biomass in order to keep up with sea level rise. If you drain a marsh too much by putting too many ditches in, for example, what you do is you actually introduce air into the peat itself. And those of you that read the book that Corin mentioned, you know that peat is a really unique thing that happens in bogs and salt marshes, where it's a lot of organic matter that's anaerobic. So that means there's no oxygen in the soil. So there's no microbes that can break down the organic matter. So peat can be really, really deep and tend to maintain and preserve anything that, it happens to be in there. And in the case of salt marshes, it's actually burying whatever grass grows every year. So Salt marshes are really productive systems. They are as productive as a rainforest, but unlike the rainforest, which decomposes and releases that carbon into the air, salt marshes actually bury all that carbon into the peat. So it's an amazing carbon sink. It's twice as effective as forests. So the partners got together and, through kind of collaboration and looking through the research, we developed a few techniques that we thought we can try by observing what the marsh was trying to do naturally and with the understanding of this idea that the marshes need to drain and it needs to flood. So we kind of developed a couple of techniques that we thought would help the marsh do that. So a runnel is a baby creek that allows the wet areas of the marsh to drain a little. So here is a runnel that is actually created by just pushing this metal piece through here. We also can dig with shovels as well as with excavators. And then we take the sediment that we dig out and we build these microtopography islands. So it just creates a little bit of elevation in the marsh. And also it mimics something that happens naturally in the marsh, which is that these large ice chunks with peat gets deposited in the winter. And this process is really important for the salt marsh to keep up with sea level rise. So here's some photos from one of our pilot projects on the Refuge. And on the left, you see that there is kind of these berms that were built. In 2017, we cut through these berms to allow the area to drain. So this is kind of what it looks like. So a lot of open water. I think we had just cut it, so the water just drained off, but it's still a lot of mud flats. 2 years later, all of this has revegetated. And in the aerial photo, you can see it's a lot drier. In 2019, we also cut through this second berm that's here, as well as one that's down here. And then in 4 years later, you can see that the marsh is a lot drier now. And this marsh that was bare mud has now revegetated to very robust high marsh grass or hay grass, which is kind of the highest elevation marsh that we can get. So another technique that we use is called ditch remediation or healing the ditches. When you have too many ditches, as I mentioned, we oxidize the peat and we causes decomposition and subsidence. And over time, some of these ditches clog and they form these pools behind it, and the vegetation dies and we lose elevation that way as well. So there's been many attempts to try to heal these ditches, and a lot of them were problematic. This is actually a technique that Jeff Wilson came up with, which is to mow the hay that's already there, which a lot of salt marsh hayers today are still doing. And we put it into the ditch itself and tie it down with these stakes and biodegradable twine. And this hay traps sediment as the tide comes in and out, and it rebuilds peat so that it completely heals and erases the ditch, so that we have a ditch system, channel network system that's more similar to what it would have been like before all the ditches were put in. So with the marsh, I like to think of the marsh hydrology as like the Goldilocks. We don't want it too wet and we don't want it too dry. And these two techniques that we've developed really kind of try to get to the same thing. So if an area is too wet, we create a little runnel and then we let the water take over and kind of come to equilibrium and resize itself. But it helps drop the water, the shallow water just underneath the root zone, so that the plants can be healthy. If it's an area that is too deep because of these deep ditches that were dug, we put hay in it. Over time, this is like 3 treatments, the ditch heals up and shallows up, and then it starts growing vegetation. And once it starts growing vegetation, it's no longer a ditch and it pushes the water to the adjacent ditches. So this is now we are, now that we know that these techniques work independently and have had good success at the local level, we're putting it together and trying to restore whole marsh hydrology. So this is the photo I showed before of all the ditches and berms that were in this area. A lot of it has healed, as I mentioned, but what it leaves behind is these big pools and wet areas. So the blue is the existing creeks, the orange is the runnels we're creating, and then the green are the ditch remediation. So these are ditches that we will heal. So the green will disappear. And then when we are done, we will have this channel network that should be in equilibrium with the marsh so that it will flood and ebb and will adjust itself to the increased flooding that we can get with sea level rise and storm surge. So, we're pretty excited. It's been about 8 years, and we have a suite of techniques that have really seems to work. And the partners that have been involved and we've shared the data with are all really excited. Organizations like the trustees of reservations have already kind of scaled up and done their own pilots on their land. But really, it's a race against time to save both our homes that, I think we've all experienced this winter, what kind of flooding we could be getting and how fast it can accelerate. There's also a species of bird called the salt marsh sparrow that nests in salt marshes only from Maine to Delaware that is very vulnerable to flooding. So these birds nest in the ground. And when the tide comes, they need to actually hatch their chicks and have their chicks get big enough so that they can climb out of the nest in the 25 days in between flooding tides. So here is a nest that is flooded and moms come back and sits on it. I'll play again. It's actually okay for the eggs to be flooded occasionally. For a few hours, the mom will warm it back up. But obviously, if the chick is still in the nest and too young and the flooding tide comes, the chick won't make it. So, the predictions is that if we don't turn things around for this bird by 2030, we can really lose this species, which only occurs in the United States of America. So as I mentioned, this has been a very collaborative work all along. And now that we know that these techniques work, a lot of different organizations like the trustees, Mass Wildlife, Audubon, Greenbelt, all taking these same techniques and they are implementing or they're planning to do this work on their own land. So this is a map of the Great Marsh. The orange is the project that the Refuge just got permitted. So that's 1,400 acres, a little bit bigger than that. And we started work this past spring and we will be continuing that for the next couple of years. The green is areas owned by all different organizations that have been in design or have preliminary designs. And the purple is trustees' land that have funding for restoration using the same techniques that we talked about. So overall, we expect to restore a little over 6,000 acres in the next 5 to 6 years in the Great Marsh. We have gotten quite a bit of funding for our projects. The funding organizations have been very excited about the work that we're doing in the Great Marsh, and it has really become the model for landscape restoration kind of on the ground level up. And, we're also really excited that just in the last 6 months, we've also made a lot of progress from the permitting standpoint. We can talk a little bit more about it in the Q&A, but Massachusetts have some very strong wetland protection regulations, which is amazing and good. But from a restoration standpoint, it's been really difficult to get projects of this size permitted. And the last few months, DEP have been working with us to try to figure out how to get these projects funded. And we've made some real progress and it's going to be working on some new regulations to help get these projects implemented. I'm going to pause here in case anybody has questions about the work that I just talked about. A few moments to talk about kind of the principles of that we use for the Great Marsh project, and how towns might apply it as they are looking to nature-based techniques or so I cannot see the chat. So Corinne, if anything comes in the chat, or feel free to unmute as well.
Sure. I just want to, I don't know if it was just my screen, but you froze for a minute there and I didn't hear what you said. So you might want to just repeat the last couple of minutes when this slide came up.
Okay, sorry. You said
That's
I
okay.
suppose. Yeah. I was getting a message for unstable internet connection, so
Okay.
I might be. Yeah, hold on for 1 sec. Are you still seeing my screen?
Yes. And it
Okay, sorry.
looks like Elisa has her hand raised.
Okay.
So I understand that sea level rise is accelerating maybe more than what some of the models have said. Is this sort of a race against time with you all and with all of us, I guess? And how does that impact the restoration work you're doing in terms of getting it done and seeing, I guess, the marsh would move if sea level rise goes? So could you just talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I think, the sea level rise models are more complicated than like the number that we usually see, right? Like 2.3 millimeters for Boston or 2.5, and that is increasing every year. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is, the international panel puts out models, like global sea level rise models, every 5 years. And every time they do it, they add kind of another piece of the puzzle. So the earlier ones are more simplistic and not as representative. So I know like the last one that they released includes melting of the ice caps and glaciers, which they've never included in previous versions. So obviously that increased the numbers. And then the second component is that depending on where you are in the world, the global average may be higher or lower than for your area. So some areas of the world are sinking, and that's kind of the geology of the earth, right? So some areas are sinking and some areas are increasing. So there's actually some areas in the US where sea level rise is going down because the land is rising, whereas other areas are, the land is sinking. So that increases sea level rise. And things like pumping of water. And so human activities do have an impact on the kind of the position of the land in relation to the ocean. For our project, we don't worry too much about the specific of the model, because, when you have a model that is looking 30 years out or 50 years out, they give you a general direction, but the number you see is probably going to be wrong. Because things are changing constantly and we're learning more all the time. So our objective is to get the marsh as healthy as possible. And we know really high right now. It doesn't get flooded too often. So as I mentioned earlier on, the more it floods, it might transition to this other grass, which will actually speed up the rate of accretion. So the marsh will actually gain elevation faster once that switches. So from that standpoint, the marsh and Plum Island and the Great Marsh have over 1,000 years of life minimum. So our job is to get it as healthy as possible, because nature will take care of itself if we can get it healthy. And then it will also take care of, hopefully, all those houses and roads that's behind there, because natural systems are really good at slowing down wave action and a lot of the climate impacts that we see coming.
I don't see any other hands raised or questions in the chat, but I was wondering if other organizations who manage marshland like this around the country are learning from you and applying these principles to their own land.
There's definitely a variety of it. There are similar efforts going on in Maine, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, Virginia. Some of the other states, so a lot of the states in the mid-Atlantic, their marshes are a lot lower. So they're actually beginning to lose their marsh. So they're beginning to take more drastic actions like adding sediment to the marsh, which is pretty expensive, but they've had kind of some success. The mid-Atlantic, Maryland and Virginia also have been the leaders of like living shoreline. So kind of planting grass and, oysters with grass. So kind of hybrid engineer solutions to try to slow the erosion and the wave action. And they've had some pretty good success with that. And that's both in the coastal system near marshes, as well as upstream in the rivers, which is actually pretty similar to what might be more applicable to the Merrimack River in West Newbury.
Thank you. A question came into the chat asking if there's been any pushback from birders related to your work in the marsh.
It's been largely supportive. When we were initially doing the early pilot projects and as we were scaling up, our first pilot projects were on the refuge right adjacent to the road, because they were mostly kind of, a lot of the ponds were in the upland edges of the marsh. I did do a lot of outreach to the birders to explain what was happening. And there was definitely some projects where there was some concern from the birders about how the birds would react. The salt pans is a good example. So if you've ever been to the refuge, right before you get to the third parking lot, there's a large pan there that I guess, in the 1970s used to be really great shorebird habitat. So these are like sandpipers and dunlins and like the birds that are flying from the Arctic through the US to South America. And for the last couple of decades, they've been seeing ducks. And so when they came to me with this issue, I said, I was kind of studying what was happening to the salt marsh. And I'm like, oh, yeah, well, this makes sense. The pool is getting deeper because we've lost all this vegetation. So the marsh, the peat underneath is subsiding. So the shorebirds are disappearing because it's too deep for them. And we've kind of stopped the flooding and the ebbing of that pool. So when we kind of, decided that the runnels was something that was viable and we wanted to expand it, that was one of the areas we expanded to. And I was definitely kind of crossing my fingers that everything will go well. I had suspicion that it would create really, really great shorebird habitat. And it actually worked better than I thought. It's the way the hydrology works now. About 3 weeks out of the month, it's shallow and exposed, and you get a lot of shorebirds. And then 1 week out of the month, it gets flooded and the ducks come in. So we get actually both, and it's like really great bird watching right now. But there's definitely, yeah, some concerns. And then I think, change is always hard, and there's some changes that's coming that's a little bit harder. There's so much restoration that, we're currently doing. The one I presented about is relatively uncontroversial, but there's some changes coming in the future to make the refuge more resilient, the refuge habitat more resilient. That is a little bit more controversial with the birding community.
Thank you. I don't see anything else in the chat right now.
Okay. So yeah, I thought, for our discussion, I would just queue up kind of some principles and lessons that, might be able to be applied to West Newbury and other communities. So this was actually a site visit, at least I don't know if you remember when this, I think this must be 2020 from us all wearing masks. So this is Jeff Wilson, the one that kind of, developed all these techniques that we're using in the Great Marsh. And we're looking at the issues on River Road to see what might be the underlying cause. So one thing we learned working on the refuge in the Great Marsh is that we need to understand the change that's happening and decide if we can live with the change or if something we need to address. So some examples, I talked about kind of this hay marsh grass. Can you excuse me for one sec? Hey. That is switching from this soil marsh hay grass to the low marsh grass. And, that is something that is going to happen. The work that we're doing is going to slow that down because the historical alterations are accelerating that. So by restoring the flooding and restoring the ebbing, we're already seeing actually the Peyton's Marsh come back where there used to be pools or used to be alternate flora. So we are kind of reversing the trend a little bit, but over the long term, this transition is going to happen. And, I don't know that that's something we necessarily want to stop. There's going to be some shifts in species. So we're losing smelt because of warmer waters, but the species, south species like this fiddler crab has kind of established in Plum Island. And I'm kind of excited to see them move into the area. Ice rafts is ice raft event that coincided with the northeaster that deposited about 10 years worth of sediment into the marsh. Did I just cut out again?
You did. If you can just, when you introduce the ice raft picture, you cut out for a second. So if you
Okay.
can just reintroduce that picture.
Yeah, so these ice rafts are happening more often now, we've noticed. And in 2019, doing one of the northeasters that happened in January, we had this huge ice raft event that deposited, numerous ice rafts from basically Boston to Portsmouth, Maine. And it deposited about 10 years worth of sediment in 1 week. So, sometimes storms and change is good. Similarly, we're seeing a lot of change on the beach, but it's not something that we're too concerned about. It's actually creating really good habitat for the wildlife that use the beach. And because our dunes are deep and we don't have a lot of infrastructure on the refuge, we can allow that shifting of sand to occur, and that dynamic nature of that movement will actually make the beach and the dune stronger in the future. So with River Road, this is a picture of River Road being undercut. It's definitely concerning because of the road that's there. And there are some nature-based techniques that, other people have done that we can bring in. But the first thing we need to understand is what is causing this. Is this wave action? Is this seepage under the road? What is the stability of the roadbed? So these are all things that we need to understand. And we've started that process with this MVP grant with the GEI, the consulting company that's been working with us, just gave us a report. So this is what we're trying to understand so that we can apply whatever solutions correctly, even understanding where the hotspots are so that we can prioritize where we need to do protection. So that's just kind of one example. So understanding what's causing it, and then if possible, if you use a nature-based techniques, things tend to be longer lasting. It tends to be more cost effective in the sometimes initially, but always in the long run. And the thing about nature-based techniques is that with a lot of engineered solutions, it's strongest the day after you build it, and then it deteriorates over time. With nature-based techniques, because you've kind of designed it to work with nature, it typically gets stronger and more resilient over time because nature takes over and helps maintain whatever it is that you put in place. Leveraging your community. I think one, Fish and Wildlife Service has always been an organization that rely on our partners a lot. And with climate change, we've just kind of come to realize that we cannot do it alone and we need everyone to help if we're going to solve some of these problems. So, we have a lot of students and youth helping us with invasive control. We're working with a lot of the surrounding landowners on green landscaping to address some of the runoff issues. We do a lot of outreach on our beach around disturbance. And similarly for the River Road issue, this is not an issue that is only that West Newbury is dealing with. There's a lot of adjacent towns. I know this is a boat tour that was given earlier actually, I guess it was last year, and last fall. And I know we invited a lot of the adjacent communities, but there's a lot of people with knowledge of what's going on the River Road. So the more people we involve, the better. And the more towns we involve to kind of come up with a holistic solution, the better. There's a lot of houses on River Road, and the land between the road and the river is mostly privately owned. So, when people are thinking about kind of what to do with this vegetation, even though some people like views, this area is protected under the Wetland Protection Act, but also shrubs and vegetation tends to reduce erosion and protect the road. So not only the upland erosion vegetation, but also the wetlands. So this is wild rice. We have some pretty extensive wild rice fields along River Road. So anytime you're designing docks or so to protect resources like that. And then on the water, there's actually a freshwater eelgrass species that is really good at slowing down wave action. So when the wave comes, all those blades of grass kind of slow that wave down. So, trying to protect those underwater and aquatic species as much as possible. And then there is going to be a lot of community science opportunities that we'll talk about later. So we definitely want people to be involved as we think about next steps for River Road. Speaking of which, there is a kayak trip coming up on June 12th, so next Wednesday. Done in collaboration with Plum Island Kayaks, who will be guiding the tour, so you can bring your own kayaks or you can rent one from them. So, when we think about what we might lose, as a federal wildlife agency, we always think of wildlife first. But, more recently, we've been thinking about that different people value different things. And we've been focusing more on how people value the refuge and what would be lost if we weren't doing the monster restoration or some of the work that we're doing. And we're using a lot of working with youth kind of to message those, as well as artists. musicians. So we're thinking about more creative ways of reaching new audiences. For River Road, our consultants, G.A.R, just presented this flooding scenario in 2030. So I chose 2030 because this is kind of the most immediate flooding issue. So these yellow areas will be flooded during a storm surge event, which, as I mentioned, happened in January, February, March, and April of this year during the high tide, making River Road inaccessible. And obviously, this impacts the whole homes that's on River Road, especially between this area and this area here. But it also impacts other people. So you know, we have fishermen that use River Road. There's a lot of birders that come to watch the eagles and other things, a lot of bikers, kayakers, walkers on River Road. So I think going forward, we're going to be wanting to hear from the community what it is that they value about River Road and how we might want to preserve that. And then I just want to put this slide in that there is a couple of events coming up. So I mentioned the kayak trip already. The week after that, there's going to be a sidewalk with our consultants on the results of their study. And then there's going to be a final public meeting. And then, but the citizen science project regarding kind of erosion and flooding on River Road is going to continue. And we're going to be thinking about next steps after this current grant ends and figuring out what to do next. So this is kind of my question slide, but I just want to leave you with two thoughts. And you feel free to type this in the chat if you want to turn on your video and come off mute, you're welcome to. So what do you value about River Road? And what do you want to know about the issues facing River Road or the potential solutions? So I'm gonna stop sharing.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That was really informative, and I wonder if anyone has any other questions for you.
I do see one, and I apologize for my internet. It's usually very good. I don't know what's going on tonight. So can I describe the kayak trip more? And Lisa, if you're on, please come up, come off mute and describe it. So you can, so it launches from the boat ramp in Amesbury and will come off onto the West Newbury kind of boat launch by the bridge. And I believe, so if you rent from Plum Island Kayaks, they'll have the kayaks for you there, and then they'll transport it back, and they'll transport you back to Amesbury if you need a ride back. If you bring your own boat, I believe you will have to coordinate your own transportation. Elisa, is that your understanding?
Yes, and I would say, look, an announcement went out on the, it's on the first page of the town website, and it also was an email blast. And you can also find it on the climate change website under the MVP grant page. I think it's strongly encouraged to use the Plum Island kayaks because of safety and other kinds of concerns. There's a registration that's now open, and people are certainly invited. It's going to work with the tide, so you won't be exhausted. And I think it ought to be a really great experience. But for the details and the sign up and all of that, I would say look on the town website. And it's like on the first page of, yeah, there, it's up on the chat. So you can find it there as well.
And the rain day is Friday, a little bit later, right?
Yeah, is it Thursday or Friday? I'm gonna have to bring up the link to see.
The rain date is Friday, June 14th,
Okay,
from 1 to 4:30, it says.
Yeah, so again, to catch that tide, because the tide will be a little bit later. Yeah.
I'll put the town's website, the homepage in the chat as well. The first link I put was for the climate change resilience committee. Thank you, Elisa. Does anyone else have a question or a comment that they'd like to make? Nope, I don't hear anyone. Well, Nancy, thank you so much for your talk tonight. It was so informative and it was really interesting. As a resident of Plum Island, I feel like I just learned so much about my backyard. So thank you so much. And thanks everyone for joining us tonight. All right. I hope everyone has a good night.
Thank you. Good night,
Nancy.
everyone.
Good night, everyone.
thank you.